Hey everybody, there was a commercial from a few years back that made me cry every time I saw it, and I wanted to share it with you to start things off tonight.
He's gonna do it! You gotta see this! Oh, he's gonna do it! Come on, come on! He's gonna do it! Alright, I'm running. I got him. Nice. Come on. Yeah, let's go. Alright. So how about another game?
So I think that if you were being totally honest, you would admit that that story in the commercial stirs something very deep inside of you. It touches a soul kind of place in your being. And I'd like to submit that the commercial is a great starting place for us as we try to understand a thing that Paul calls the righteousness of God. In chapter 1 of his letter to the Romans, in verse 16 and 17, Paul writes this. He said, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." Paul says, I am not ashamed of this thing that reveals the righteousness of God. And actually, the goal for this discussion is that by the end, we can all agree that the righteousness of God is the very thing that our souls are tuned to, and the very thing that our souls are most desperate for. And certainly, the righteousness of God is not anything to be ashamed of. So we have to understand the righteousness of God. We won't understand anything else about Paul's letter unless we understand the righteousness of God. In fact, the very next part of Paul's letter, he begins to describe how we as a human race began to get away from the righteousness of God. So what is the righteousness of God? Well, it's certainly an attribute of God's character. It describes who God is and God's nature and God's character, but it's so much more than that. The righteousness of God is a culture. The righteousness of God is a future. It's a life and it is a way. And Paul says the righteousness of God can be most clearly seen in the person of Jesus Christ. So the word righteousness itself means equity and justice. And Paul actually will go on to say that the righteousness of God, the equity and the justice of God is what we are born out of, and it's what we were born into. And while we got away from it for a time, it is the righteousness of God, the equity and justice of God that God promises to restore for all of us. So here's what I want you guys to do. Your leaders all have copies of a portion of a chapter from this book called Who is This Man? It's an incredible book. The chapter is called A Revolution in Humanity. And in it, the author tells multiple stories about how Jesus lives the righteousness of God and how he pursues the righteousness during his time here on earth. So read it, discuss the things that stand out to you or the things that are most compelling for you, and then end your time working together by doing one thing, and that's this. Create a working definition for this thing called the righteousness of God.